You have been recovering in the ship's recovery area, which has given you plenty of time to your own thoughts. You, as with the other sailors on board the ships, have a right to privilege, a per-sailor allotment for personal trade. Off-limits were goods the company traded, leaving room for creativity and, of course, illegality. Being your first trip, you had not taken goods with you for trade to acquire items to bring back on the return trip, so your only option was to trade against your wages. After a few weeks, you'd recovered enough to take an additional ship assignment. A portion of the ship's freight was to acquire goods in the lands known as India. Accompanying you and the rest of the crew was your close shipmate, Hank. Hank had an uncanny ability to see the positive of almost any situation, as well as turn the darkest and most dire situation into slapstick. In the midst of the doldrums, when morale was at its lowest and men were seemingly dying daily, he could be counted on for his grim and dire jokes and observations. Dying men, of course, no laughing matter, but when Hank spoke of them, suddenly it was. Many of the men died in prayer with arms out, still clasped in holy communion with the Almighty. These men, many of them, had only found religion on their deathbed and had criminal rap sheets, likely longer than the Gospels themselves. Hank, however, joked that they were statues of piety sent to spread the Almighty's word to the fish and other denizens of the deep. Of course, knowing that all they would spread is debauchery and sin, and nothing holy, had the survivors doubled over in laughter. India was fascinating. The smell of the markets, rich in spices and herbs you'd never heard of, never mind smelled or tasted. You had thought Batavia was crowded, but the city you were in was as large as several European cities combined. A multitude of faiths and peoples mingled on the busy streets. In Batavia, you'd benefited from eating staples of home and admittedly had done very little experimentation with food outside of its walls. Here, you had no choice and you relied on Hank, who had been here twice before, to show you the ropes and suggest you a nice mild dish reminiscent of starchy masses that you ate back home. However, upon eating a heaped fork of the stuff, your mouth immediately begins to scream with the pain of 1,000 eviscerated taste buds. Tears flowing from your eyes as during your most despaired moments. Trying your best to not alarm the locals, you immediately heap your fork with the meat next to it. You hadn't tried it yet, and were hoping it would drown the burning sensation, which now had your tongue and gums as numb as if they had fallen asleep. However, your second bite, if anything, is hotter than the first, and still you try your best to keep the food down, as ship rules dictated that any sailor caught throwing food overboard or wasting it through any other means would be instantly flogged. And although you were on shore, those rules were drilled in you. Sweat is now pouring out of every hole in your body. Swallowing offers no relief. In fact, it only extended the trail of pain down into your stomach, which immediately begins to contract and heave upon receiving the contents. Your only option now was the drink that Hank called mawa flower liquor. Rather than provide any relief, the liquid you imbibe instantly inflames your already taxed taste buds with the most intense, searing sensation you've ever felt. It was the equivalent of throwing alcohol onto a fire. The last thing you remember prior to collapsing was the sick grin on Hank's face. You periodically have a brief moment of lucidity. Hank and a fellow sailor propping you between them, your feet dragging toes first into the soft soil at the side of the buildings. Another brief moment has you heaving the contents of your stomach, strained first through your beard hair and then down your tunic and trousers. Another moment has you feeling the contents spilling out your rear in a powerful liquid jet of searing pain and discomfort. You wake up what feels like days later on a grassy knoll overlooking the market, with Hank and the other crewmen laughing hysterically. You try your best to maintain some dignity with a display of anger, but upon seeing how completely and utterly you have soiled yourself from every orifice, well, it has you joining in on the laughter with the men. The company had rules for privilege to dissuade trade of goods that they had a monopoly on, for without the VOC there would be no ships and most men abided by the rules. Or to put more appropriately, most men had the noblest of intentions for following those rules, at least early on. Months at sea and dwindling wages eroded those intentions. The resulting interpretation by many was that goods, no matter how illegal, were sanctioned. Of course, the sailor that was caught with the contraband faced a flogging and harsh wage fines. Given you were fairly certain this would be your last trip to the east, and with the aforementioned dwindling resources, you decide to throw caution to the wind. While you hadn't tried it yet, you knew that opium was extremely sought after back home, as it relieved pain and many other manners of illness. You purchased as much as you could fit into your leather drinking pouch, an amount you believe would be enough to purchase a home upon your return. What you hadn't anticipated was the check by VOC Customs once back in Batavia. You see the customs employees checking the crewmen already dockside and the skiff ahead of you carefully. You tell Hank in desperation what you had done. Thinking fast, he ties a thin support line to the satchel, weights it with some lead shot, and hangs it overboard, where it immediately sinks to the end of the line's length. You feel a sense of relief, which is immediately dispelled upon seeing the same customs employees lifting a string like your own on that same skiff ahead of you. Hank tells you to make a mental note of where we are and when close, as he will cut the line. With just seconds to spare, as you pull up dockside, he cuts the line and your profit with it to the hopefully shallow depths below. 2 men on your skiff with contraband are immediately led away in custody, but you, Hank, and the others pass through without incident. Hank pulls his own contraband from the lower portion of his backside, proud at himself for evading capture of said goods. That same evening, you spend 3 hours desperately diving at the dock to the bottom of the waters, your lungs barely able to hold on to the air at the depth of 5 to 7 meters. However, you are able to retrieve the goods within a few hours. Had you not been curious by nature, you likely could have kept the opium out of sight and mind until returning to Amsterdam to turn a healthy profit for yourself and purchase that planned home for you and a future family. Alas, the same inquisitiveness that brought you to the VOC has you deciding to sample the wares on the first night. Imbibing it as per the merchant's instructions has you immediately brought to a hallowed and warm, comfortable embrace of comfort, love, and nostalgia, your body tingling with positivity, and you cannot help but smile at everything and anything around you. Some nausea has you purging what was left of any food you ate that day, but then you're back to enjoying the sensation of this amazing substance. As you return to physical labor, of ship's crew duties, you decide to sample a little bit more. Never has the work been this effortless or time passed this quickly as it did under the influence of the poppy's milk. Even the most dull task suddenly takes on a vibrant, happy, and fulfilled intensity. Soon, it's a day here and a day there, turning into daily use. 3 weeks later, you forget your daily dose one day and have to work without it. At first, the discomfort is limited to profuse sweating, then cramps, then liquid purging out your backside. Within a few hours, your body feels as if it weighs as heavy as a cannon, and you feel like an old man schlepping your carcass about the ship's decks. Later, upon returning to the crew quarters in Batavia, you take a dose, and immediately, within minutes, you feel well again. Your ship is to be loaded in Batavia for its return journey back to the homeland. Although in a daily haze, the thought of home fills you with nostalgia. Never had the thought of your farm life or the flat, wet, and cold lands of your birth elicited such emotion and longing in you. The return journey itself, though, is not something that the crew are looking at favorably. The voyage here had taken its toll on all of you, and those who died at sea were replaced by VOC personnel from Batavia, seeking to return home as well. Some of them at the end of their service tenures, others with verbal confirmation of new treaties and trade to discuss back in Amsterdam. The loading work is back-breaking physical labor, and the hot Batavian sun only adds to the grueling nature of the work. Even Henk's humor has been somewhat dulled by the toiling nature of the work at hand. Some days later, your ship is fully loaded, but your supply of opium perilously low. After a day, the feeling of sickness is so intense you are doubled over and writhing in pain, every vein and artery in your body feeling itchy and your muscles extremely twitchy and thrashing out wildly on their own. You have a plan. You're going to borrow some of your surgeon's opium supplies. Again, the most noble of intentions turns into something else, because your plan fails almost as quickly as you had formulated it, with you making enough noise in the surgeon's quarters to wake up half the fleet. Catching you rifling through his drawers, Fontaine angrily grabs you by the forearm and yells out for assistance. You plead with him, but within seconds the ship's guards are inside and you in chains. Recognizing the reason for your sickness, Fontaine, likely more angry that you dared steal from his supply than angry at the theft itself. For a week that feels like eternity, you are chained in the ship's holding cell. Recovering from the poppy sickness feels worse than any sickness or discomfort you've ever felt in your life. You're barely fed, but all the same, as you have essentially no appetite, and what little you have eaten doesn't stay down for long. In the interim, the officers on behalf of the captain have decided your fate. You are to run the gauntlet. The running of the gauntlet was one of the VOC punishments for theft on board a ship. Admittedly, it was one of the milder punishments, as death could and was doled out for more extreme instances of theft. The running of the gauntlet was a punishment that dated back to Roman times and was still used by both military and naval organizations in the known world, i.e. the VOC or English India Company. It involved stripping the person sentenced to their waist. They were then to run between two rows of soldiers, or in this instance, company officers and other crew members, who would lash out at the person with a modified cat-o'-nine-tails. The only difference with the naval version of the punishment was that it involved not just a dash through two rows of soldiers, but around the ship's decks a number of prescribed times. To ensure a steady pace for the accused, a company officer with a sword walked just in front of the person, preventing them from dashing past. Once the person had completed the run, their punishment was deemed carried out, as was their payment for the crime. The reason for this was that the crew member, having paid for their crime rather quickly, albeit painfully, was of more use as a functional crew member than rotting in a cell, where he was of no use to anyone. You are still queasy and a bit nauseous from the poppy sickness, but are led up to the deck where your fellow crew members are waiting for you. Every second one is armed with a cat-o'-nine-tails, while the others strike out at you with hand, foot, and the pommel of their swords. As the signal is given, you feel the first lashes striking you on your back and left arm. Blood almost immediately drawn, now pouring down your backside and arms. The pain is intense, and every instinct in you is screaming and begging for you to run and move faster, but your pace is kept deliberately slow by the aforementioned officer in front of you. The pain soon becomes so intense, you feel yourself that familiar feeling of blacking out, but still you struggle forward, as failure would only mean a continuation of the beatings given. While many of those lashing out at you were under normal circumstances shipmates, acquaintances, and even friends, They were expected to not hold back, as the perception of doing so could mean equal punishment for them. After your second circuit, and with most of your body throbbing and heaving with painful nerve twitches, all while glazed in a thick layer of your own blood, you're given the signal to stop and you collapse almost immediately to the deck. You're helped back to your feet by your crewmates, who drag you to the domain of your favorite ship's crew member, the surgeon, Fontaine. To prevent infections on open wounds when at sea, the surgeons would first rinse the recently punished with salty ocean water before massing thick chunks of salt into the gaping wounds. Again, your pain senses spike at the salt touching the open wounds, and you howl out in pain. After a few more days, you rejoin the crew in your daily tasks, but you still need time to heal completely. The beauty of the sea voyages such as this was that you had more time than you knew what to do with. Eventually the wounds healed closed, leaving only the scars which, like a macabre set of tattoos, marked out your recent punishment in full display for all to see. As the weeks on board the ship fold into months, you continue your voyage back home to the Dutch fatherland. Your stamina, now hardened from almost 2 years at sea, fares better on the return trip, but still, there are many casualties along the way. After 3 seasons, your ship arrives at the North Sea and begins its meandering up the coast of the Republic before turning south of Texel towards the inland sea and Amsterdam. The site of Amsterdam, so long an unremembered dream, now lies once again majestically before you. Gentle wind rocking the many ships at its port as church bells ring out, signaling noontime. The VOC sailors returning to Amsterdam were often called Lords of 6 weeks, as this was the approximate amount of time it took these men to squander and flaunt their sudden wealth. You receive the balance of your pay and spend the first night celebrating with your friend Hank. Hank, possessing his pay, starts the festivities off with what looks to be a barrel of gin. After 2 hours, Hank and you stumble out of the tavern, only to look for a new place to stay until the wee hours of the morning. Hank, who is more inebriated than you have ever seen him, orders a coach not only for you both, but another for his pipe and tobacco box, and a third coach for his hat. You and Hank and your small caravan of coaches clomps throughout the cobblestone streets, stopping at various taverns where you sample their house best before departing for the next. Daylight eventually greets you both, and finally you retire at an inn. The act of the night before is repeated for many more nights, which then blend into weeks, until the gnawing realization hits you that your funds have been all but spent. The next few weeks sees you returning to your family's farm, where you assist your father and mother, and never again venture out and beyond the VOC shipping lanes. You would, however, travel via land to some of the other countries surrounding the Republic, including the Flemish lands to the south, where you would meet your future wife. You receive word that Hank, having sailed again with the VOC, has died, but no cause other than service to the VOC is given. In time, you have several kids, but becoming a grandparent is something that you would not be destined to go on to do. In your 4th decade, you die tending the fields of your farm on a cold and unremarkable December day. The gravestone marking your life still visible in the Goudenrok Cemetery. This marks the end of life on board a VOC trade ship in the 17th century. I really hope you've enjoyed this series. I've got some exciting content in store for the next first-person series, which will focus on the Aztec culture. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, please consider subscribing. As always, and until the next video, cheers.